Mikhail Gorbachev served as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU, from 1985 to 1991. In the last 2 years of being General Secretary, Gorbachev also took on the position of President of the Soviet Union. This lasted from 1990 to 1991. During the early months of his leadership in 1985, Gorbachev delivered a speech in Leningrad. This speech distinguished his character from others because he spoke out on the flaws of the USSR's economic status. This speech, in part, defined Gorbachev as a different type of leader because he was the first person to speak out on these issues in the Communist Party. Additionally, Gorbachev's leadership sparked the execution of many of his policies, such as perestroika, glasnost, that ultimately resulted in the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Gorbachev oversaw some of the most fundamental changes in the USSR's economic and political structure since the Russian Revolution. The hastiness of these reforms, however, with the growing instability, contributed to the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Gorbachev's biggest aim was to end the Cold War, and he was determined to do so. He viewed the Cold War as being too costly and hindering his own implementation of perestroika and glasnost. A central focus of this aim was to modernize the USSR, which perestroika and glasnost would set the tone to fulfill his goals. Vladislav Zubok, a post-post revisionist, described Gorbachev as being a leader that knew and had a sense of controlling how he wanted things to be done and how to execute them. Zubok stated, "In the realm of foreign affairs, he wanted to end the Soviet Union's isolation, dismantle the old ideological dogmas, all while reinvigorating the now stagnant Soviet Union." Perestroika was to be the transformation of the Communist Party. Its intent was to make it more responsive to the needs of the people. This was to be done through a series of political and economic reforms that aimed to activate the static Soviet Union economy. From the political aspects of these policies, elections were introduced as an attempt to reflect the Western ways of democratization. From an economic standpoint, perestroika ended the price controls established by the government from the past 7 decades. Following Gorbachev's speech in Leningrad, he gave another speech introducing glasnost. Glasnost regarded the openness and transparency of a new era. The goal of this policy was to include more people in the political process through freedom of expression and being able to voice their criticisms to the government. Some important effects resulted from glasnost, such as the decrease in media censorship, which gave more freedom to writers and journalists to expose aspects of government corruption. The Chernobyl disaster was the first crisis Gorbachev had to deal with. In April 1986, a massive explosion from a nuclear power station in Chernobyl released radioactive particles into the atmosphere. It was taken over with very little proper safety precautions that endangered many firemen and civilians. Chernobyl became symbolic to many of the problems that plagued the Soviet Union, enforcing it being referred to as a turning point by Gorbachev. As Gorbachev's main focus was political and economic reform, he had no hesitation in responding with his train of solutions. He knew that if he wanted his plans to succeed, he needed a branch of people who agreed with his resolutions. This led Gorbachev to add 5 of his own supporters to the Politburo. He knew that the party would still be one of his biggest obstacles because 60% of the Central Committee was still made up of Brezhnev's appointees. Along with Gorbachev's implementation of new policies came with a civilian uproar when their government had been beginning to dismantle. Due to the decrease in censorship of media, the people were now being exposed to the corruption that backfired on the government, making them weak. When the totalitarian state fell apart, the citizens were very unfamiliar with their new world of lack of regulation and command. An increase in social protest arose from the fear of those who had heard about rates of crime that were now exposed to the public. These events were the opposite and went against what Gorbachev aimed to accomplish.
Gorbachev's foreign policy contributed to the end of the Cold War. He felt that security was something from which everyone could benefit. He didn't attempt to collect as many nuclear weapons as possible, but rather claimed that the USSR had done and would do all that was necessary to guarantee its security. The USSR would not take any steps beyond the normal demands and requirements of reasonable, sufficient defense. In the summer of 1989, Polish voters elected a non-communist oppositional government to their legislature, and everyone expected Soviet forces to prevent this new government from assuming power. Gorbachev refused to condone the use of violence to quell demonstrations, however, and by the fall of 1989, Eastern European communist dictatorships were falling. East and West Germans were tearing down the Berlin Wall. Not all of these events stemmed from intentional plans by Gorbachev. Some of them were miscalculations. He wanted to reform communism rather than replacing it, but his reforms quickly turned into a revolution. Gorbachev is widely credited with being the leader who caused the downfall of the Soviet Union, but also who brought an end to the Cold War. Gorbachev extensively reformed the foreign ministry, the most notable replacement being of Andrei Gromyko, who had been foreign minister for more than 20 years and was highly regarded by the people, with Eduard Shevardnadze. Gorbachev also gained some control over the Ministry of Defense, which allowed him to have more freedom in arms control negotiations. His main goal in foreign policy was to reduce threat perceptions in the West and to avoid another arms race, which he was able to do with the help of Shevardnadze. In December of 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which bound both sides to remove that type of missiles from Europe. Gorbachev declared that the end of the Civil War was the shattering of the vicious cycle into which we had driven ourselves, and a victory for common sense, reason, democracy, and common human values. And his shift in policies from his predecessor managed to bring an end to the Cold War. The Gorbachev era has been an era of large disagreement among different American historians of varying schools of thought. Unlike American scholars, Soviet writers produced sympathetic accounts because they had little choice but to conform to official views. According to Vladislav Zubok, there is no proper historiography of the Cold War in Russia. Absolute control over intellectual life guaranteed that all writings on the origins and phases of the Cold War had to reflect official legend. According to Michael Hopkins of Cambridge University, it is harder to categorize historians as orthodox or revisionist, although studies can be divided into those seeing Gorbachev's policy as crucial and others that emphasize American strategies. So-called traditionalist American historians, such as Michael Hart, believe that the Cold War was caused by the military aggression and goal of Stalin and his successors to impose communism on the world. Consequently, Gorbachev's era was one during which the Cold War melted away because the leader was willing to abandon the image of communism in the Western world. So-called post-revisionists argue that Gorbachev was a flawed but historically significant individual, someone who understood that change was essential if the Soviet Union was to remain a major power. They chalked up the Cold War to neither the US or the USSR. They also argue that Gorbachev deserves some credit for allowing the peaceful demise of the Soviet Union rather than trying to use force to hold it all together. Zubok, one of the few Soviet historians at the time, asserts that Gorbachev did more than anyone else to end the Cold War. In this, he echoes the opinion of Reagan himself, who always credited Gorbachev with bringing the Cold War to an end. Ultimately, the collapse of the Soviet Empire came from within. The economic problems gave rise to reformist policies which eroded the strength of the revolutionary imperial paradigm and power of the Soviet Union. Although historians seemingly disagree about Gorbachev's role in the Cold War, they all seem to agree that Gorbachev was forced into a position over which he did not have much control.